because I think one of the challenges that exists in talking about election interference and some of the very, very troubling circumstances, whether it be the Hogue report that certainly was very enlightening, or the circumstances around other examples of election interference, is that when the Prime Minister makes a declaration saying that there wasn't an issue with either the 2019 or 2021 election, that their integrity was preserved, et cetera, et cetera. I think that something that is failed to be acknowledged, and actually is interestingly a very Americanization type statement, because it speaks to not our system, but rather a system that is so often reflective in the narrative that defines much of the political commentary in Canada. Because there is not one election in Canada. It is 300 in the case of the current and previous two parliaments. There are 338 separate elections. We don't elect a president. We don't elect a prime minister. And that may even be a shock to those who are listening, that I would make a statement like that. But it is by convention that the Prime Minister is the leader of the government. And I know that there's a host of history that goes back into as to why that's the case, and there's been constitutional challenges, but more or less the evolution of 800 or so years of Westminster-style democracy. So what is deeply troubling, and the reason why I want to highlight a few of those specific things, is because when we have a statement said that there wasn't interference in the election, well, let's look at some of the rules surrounding what an election is. Take financial rules, and all of us as members of Parliament and as those who have been involved in the process of running in an election, all of us around this table would have had our names on a ballot at the very least once, and some of us more than that, whether we were successful or unsuccessful. We would understand some of the dynamics around finances and rules around advertising and the various, and we've talked fairly at length about some of those things. But Chair, I think that one of the intricacies of our system that needs to be highlighted in the context of what we are talking about here is how important and the needed understanding that when a election race in the context of a larger general election, and that's why they're called general elections in Canada. It's because there is a dissolving of Parliament. Parliament is dissolved, and there ceases to be members of Parliament. That Parliament literally ceases to exist. In fact, the constitutional clarity around that is pretty direct. So while, and for any of us who have been in those circumstances, we understand that there are changes that do in fact take place. But then there are 300 in the case of the current Parliament and the previous two, 338 elections that take place to elect members of Parliament to create a Parliament. And then there are some nuances around by-elections when somebody either resigns or passes away, as we've seen tragically. I know that there's been a number of those circumstances over the last number of parliaments. Those dynamics exist, but I think that what was absolutely irresponsible of our Prime Minister was to make such a definitive statement that was simply not true. Simply not true, Chair. And I think that and the Hogue inquiry made that point explicitly clear. And I'll get into a few of the specifics, highlighting some of the frustrations that certainly and I know many of my constituents reach out to me on a regular basis when it comes to how the Prime Minister approaches things that would put his political circumstances at risk versus those of his adversaries, and I'll get to that in a few minutes. But, Chair, I think that what needs to be highlighted, and for all those watching, I would emphasize this, that when one election, when one of those 338 is called into question, it causes questions to be asked about the entire system. Now, the allegations have been very clearly articulated, and my colleague, Mr. Brock, did a good job of outlining that in the constituency of Steveston, Richmond East. But there are a number of other circumstances, and I know, and in part because this is the Parliament is an interesting place. You get to know people. And I know, having gotten to know Mr. Chu over the time that he served as an MP, including hearing from him how his stance to protect democracy was weaponized against him by malicious forces. But there were a number of other examples. And is it, can one definitively say that, point to a specific instance and say, well, that was the turning point? Well, it would be incredibly difficult and quite frankly irresponsible to do so, in the same way that it would be irresponsible to claim that there was no influence. But therein lies the key, Chair. We have to take seriously these allegations, because when one vote is compromised, it calls into question the entire system. When it comes to the integrity of our elections, it was incredibly irresponsible for the Prime Minister to make the assertion that he did. And I don't know whether that was an intentional deflection. I don't know whether that was ignorance to what may have been happening under his watch. And certainly and I know certainly many have postulated about why he may have said those things. But the evidence has become increasingly clear that the direct benefactor of some of these very serious instances of interference that did have a noted effect. Did that change the results of the election? Well, we cannot make clear, definitive statements about the totality of that, but what is absolutely clear is that it did have an effect. And as a result, the trust in the entire electoral process is compromised, especially when it is not taken seriously. So, Chair, what we have before us is a number of seats. It's been said that it could be as many as 8 seats where there was a noted effect of what the difference between being that a hostile foreign actor, whether the communist dictatorship in Beijing or others. I know there's been a number of other instances where other states and quasi-state organizations have had an impact in endeavoring to influence the outcome of elections. But the fact that it was so flippantly disregarded, I think it cannot be ignored. And when we have such clear evidence, when it comes to the riding in question in the Lower Mainland, where we've heard the testimony, we've seen the reporting, and there is it is difficult to dispute the fact that it had an impact on the rights, and it just does not come down to who sits in Parliament necessarily. That's the result. But it comes down to whether or not Canadians are truly able to exercise their franchise. And I would suggest to you, Mr. Chair, that when those circumstances are called into question, it constitutes a direct threat on our democratic institutions. Because at the very basis of what our democracy is, it comes down to trust. We have to be able to trust the process. We have to be able to trust the institutions. We have to be able to trust that when you go into that ballot, into that voting booth and mark your ballot, that you trust that not only your vote will be counted, but that each and every vote in that electoral district, and multiplied by, as I said in the case where we are in this Parliament, 338, I believe it'll be 343 in the next Parliament with a few seats added, you have to be able to trust that. And where I think, Chair, the conversation and why this motion, I would suggest, is so incredibly valuable is because we have to be willing to ask the tough questions. So whether it's in the Lower Mainland in BC, or whether it's the vote that every Canadian has the opportunity to cast in each and every electoral district across our country, without having that trust and without us being able to have some of those difficult conversations, that it erodes our ability to address the challenges that are clear our system is facing. Now, Chair, when it comes to the specifics around misinformation and disinformation, I'm glad we're able to have some of these conversations, because being able to confront that head on is absolutely key. And I would note specifically, when dealing with the circumstances surrounding the communist dictatorship in Beijing, that it became so very clear that there was a concerted effort that did have one political party in particular was a specific benefactor of those efforts. And that's not simply me talking, but that is a clear consensus of what has been derived from the many conversations, whether it be testimony before a number of committees, whether it be the reporting that's been done on it, whether it be Justice Hoag's report. It is very, very clear that that's the case. Yet when the Prime Minister, who has the first and what should be the foremost responsibility of a Prime Minister, is not their political fortunes. Now, that may be a surprise that a politician would say that, but I think that the circumstances to which we find ourselves in have muddied some of the waters surrounding the integrity that needs to be had in the entirety of the process. So if we cannot have some of those difficult conversations, it allows for these instances to be amplified. And talking about it is kind of a step one, I would suggest, Chair. And the investigations, whether the Hoag report or otherwise, needs to be an important kind of step two. But ultimately, it needs to come down to addressing the challenges that were brought forward. And here is where I would suggest that we see one of the biggest failures of Justin Trudeau's leadership. When his political aspirations were the possibility of those being compromised, he spared no expense, was willing to step in immediately and make requests to see social media posts removed, to silence anybody that might be amplifying that disinformation. Yet, Chair, this is what is so astounding. Had he been consistent in that being the case for those who would be seen as his political rivals, one could respect the fact that he wanted integrity in the process. But, Chair, he didn't. When it came to whether it's Mr. Chu and being called, and some of and for those watching, you know, I cannot imagine the hell that Mr. Chu and his family went through when being called a traitor to his race, being called the anti-Chinese, somebody who is a proud Canadian of Chinese descent. Can you imagine, Chair, that your heritage called into question? And to see that there was such flippant disregard of the impact that has on the integrity of our electoral process, which comes directly back to Canadians being empowered. Now, Chair, it won't be any surprise to you, and I know there's a number of other rural members that sit around this committee, but rural MPs spend a lot of time driving. And I listened to a book over the course of the last constituency break, and it was talking about, by and large, the construction of the railway across Canada and the role that played in stitching together Confederation. I won't go into details of that. It's a fascinating book. But what was very eye-opening is a reminder, and I know, having remembered learning some of these things in high school, but specifically how Chinese Canadians, the heritage to which many of them came to this country, it's not a positive story. And the fact that multiple governments, I think it was Wilfrid Laurier, a $500 head tax on Chinese Canadians. I believe it was implemented right around the turn of the 20th century. That sort of legacy, and then all of a sudden you have in the case of Mr. Chu, somebody with Chinese heritage is able to attain elected office, and then to have the rug pulled out from under you in being able to have a fair fight. Nobody runs for office knowing that they'll win. And if they do, they certainly have the wrong attitude. Because certainly, whether it's so-called safe seats or swing seats or whatever the case is, whatever commentators would suggest, no parliamentarian, I would suggest, and certainly I would never take for granted, any electoral result, because it comes back to the people. It comes back to making sure that people, Canadians, are able to have their voices heard. So we see how the Prime Minister took quick and immediate action when it had to do with his political fortunes, yet either refused or delayed action when it came to those who might otherwise. And what creates such a concerning trend to this, Chair, is that when it comes to the actions of, that's not an isolated incident. We had, in fact, it was astounding. Not only is there these series of things that suggest that the Trudeau Liberals have been soft on the communist dictatorship in Beijing, but there's a whole host of reasons as to why some of those troubling allegations seem to be ringing true. And specifically, I would highlight how when a motion was brought forward to the House for a vote, there was an opportunity to condemn the genocide of Uyghur Muslims, a minority group in China that has been persecuted relentlessly, forced abortions, sterilizations, slave-type labor. Like, we're talking the worst of the worst possible circumstances. What did the government do? There's been a number of opportunities, and they've since hardened their tone, and I would suggest that the pressure that has been applied by Conservatives and many across our country, including diaspora groups. But when you had a Minister of the Crown abstain on behalf of the government, that's a quote. Not only was that a astounding lack of understanding of our parliamentary system, which I won't get into too much detail in terms of how insulting, quite frankly, that was. But it speaks to an unwillingness to call out abuses that were so clear to the international community, where Canada, at one point in time, could be trusted to be a leader on calling out those sorts of things. Yet you had the Trudeau Liberals, out of fear of offending a dictatorship, that it's very clear that the current Prime Minister, Mr. Trudeau, has spoken about prior to his election an admiration for, but also has continued in and that's not me simply saying things. He said that very thing when asked what country he admires. He could have said anything. He could have even prefaced that by giving caveats, but you can look at the quote. It's absolutely astounding. But, Chair, we see how in that instance and so many others there was a refusal to take firm action. Leadership requires making hard choices. And unfortunately, when it comes to many of the hard choices when dealing with the seriousness of protecting our democratic infrastructure, the Liberals are found wanting. And it's unfortunate that there seems to just be this unwillingness to have some of these tough conversations. And what I would suggest, Chair, is that it's not for a lack of possibilities in terms of actually fixing the problem. But I would suggest that at the root of how we fix those things is we need leadership. We need leadership as a nation. We need leadership as all of us collectively as parliamentarians, because it is 338 MPs that make up a parliament. And it is the government that is then subject to parliament. It is not the other way around. And it is quite something when you have the unwillingness of members of the government to take strong stands. You know, I think of previous prime ministers that have taken very, very strong stands, whether it is former Prime Minister Harper, when he refused to shake Vladimir Putin's hand, telling him to get out of Ukraine, telling that evil man to get out of Ukraine a decade ago.